Salutations, ladies and gentlemen. Today's topic is on the housing supply and what went wrong, how we fix it. First, we'll do the diagnosis like any good doctor, and then we will do the prognosis and the remedies. So today, it's a fairly dire situation for the UK because of this really interesting combination of factors which is leading to what is a fairly disastrous housing market for anyone under the age of 40 who's not got their foot in the door, so to speak. It's a pretty difficult topic to fix or like amend in policy terms because there's a lot of competing policies which necessarily conflict the ability to buy a home in different ways. So there's a push-pull mechanism in the function of home cost and ownership levels. Anyhow, it's also important to remember that, and I think this gets lost a lot of the times, that home and housing has such an importance in the, well, Anglo-Saxon, but the Faustian mindset and the feeling of well-being. So to start with, I have this quote from Spengler in Decline of the West where he says, "Property is a primary feeling and not a concept. It belongs to time and history and destiny, and not to space and causality. It cannot be logically based, but it is there." Property, particularly if you've owned a home, gives you a feeling that is distinguishable from renting and potentially even more meaningful than residing in a family home when you're younger or in your youth. You have such a strong tie to a house once you buy it. I think hopefully you will reflect that in your own feelings towards owning a home, that you'll either see the amount of pride and happiness something like that can give you. So I really am hoping that this situation can be fixed because the well-being of society can be tracked a lot back to home ownership, and even peasants back in the day at least had security around where they lived in their hovels versus lifetime renters in London bouncing from flat to flat every 18 months. Anyhow, it's just important to clarify that housing is not a very fungible good in the sense that yes, you can trade it for money, but then you still need to live somewhere. So it's not necessarily the best thing to just sell and then move and then sell and then move. So it also reflects as it's situation locally geographically tied. So if you have a job and a family in a location, it's not just oh yeah, but we built 200,000 houses this year in the UK, move into one of those, because obviously the UK is a very big country. That house could be anywhere from Dulwich to Aberdeen. So it's important to understand that the houses are not just pins on maps where you can just easily transfer between them. They also have hidden costs. So if you've bought a home, you know this, but there's stamp duty, there's legal fees, inspection fees, you'll have painting, renovating. So every time you buy a house, you come with what might be about 10% of the house price in just costs, transaction costs and moving in costs, etc. And it can go higher than that, obviously, particularly if you have to now renovate what is a 1960s, 70s council flat or something, which is probably in horrible condition, or even older villas and it's called maybe rural properties, but farmhouses, things like this. So if you are moving, the countryside is cheap, let me move out there, or you're looking at a house that maybe was built in the 18th century and only had minor repairs and renovations done to it. So there's a huge amount of requirements when it comes to upkeep costs, etc. So let's try and dispel some of the rumors or the might call illogical notions of how it's fine and we're just going to be able to deal with it politically. This is a very troubling situation. So what I'll jump into here is just to show you, first and foremost, that we have a huge amount of monthly rent. So if you look at these regions here, you can see that in London the average monthly rent is £2,000. So that equates to about £24,000 per year. And remembering, when you have a salary, you are post-tax. So it's fine and dandy to say I'm on £100,000 in London, but effectively if you're taxed at what is 40%, you're only taking home 60, then you're spending nearly half of your take-home pay, say like 60%, 40% on just renting. Renting being money that's not earning you equity, it's just providing you somewhere to live. Now, the trajectory of your career, £100,000 might be nothing, or not nothing, but your starting salaries if you're a lawyer or working in the city. But if you're a normal median wage earner in a management role or IT sector or something, then 100k is fairly close to your ceiling in terms of, will I ever go above 160, 170? Probably not. Therefore, it's very important to understand that this is also the average. The average is not necessarily too skewed here. Median prices in rentals is not as important when it comes to a bit more of a Gaussian distributed housing market. There's not as many on each end to really disrupt the middle. But in saying that, it's still super important to understand that every single city, basically, or urban area in the UK is being hampered by this, and you can see anything from up to 10% changes year on year. So Southampton being the worst affected on a percentage change. So unless your salary went up 10% last year, you're now just X% lower better off when it comes to renting. So first of all, we can say that at the moment today, renting costs, which is not home ownership, but just the ability to live somewhere, is extremely high, which is a pain. Then if we look at potentially what is the average household size, so you have to remember, like I said before, it's a multivariate calculus when it comes to home supply versus demand. There's been a huge drop off between how many people are domiciled at a residence since at least the 1980s here, which you can see there's a massive drop off now to where we're sitting at about 2.4 people per house. So you might think, oh, the 2.65 down to 2.4, that's not a meaningful difference, except the population's gotten larger and you've taken, say, 20%, 10% off of used to live together to now needing their own place. So you've both increased the number and the required number supplied by per person. Households just getting smaller means there's just less people living in each house. And this is particularly true for UK born, where we can see, so this might be, say, immigrants are more likely to live in more family homes in that sense, grandparents, etc., whereas the UK born people are much lower, down to 2.3 here. Once again, it's important to contextualize housing in both the strata of how much it costs and where it is situated, because the UK is such a complex economy where basically London is a massive outlier in terms of salaries. So it's not enough to say, and we can see here the average price in London is £500,000 whereas if you go, okay, yeah, but it's very cheap if I lived in the northwest, it's only 200, or even the Yorkshire and the Humber, it's £200,000. But then what's the median salary or the household income of the Yorkshire and Humber? It's, I think, something like £35,000. So that the median household only earns what is amounting to 6x their salary in total home ownership costs, which is something the bank won't give you a loan for anything more than about 5 times your annual salary. So if you earn collectively with your spouse £50,000, the bank might feel comfortable at the extreme lending you £250,000. You will need cash usually deposited, and at 10%, 20%, depending on how much and what kind of loan you're able to get structured, means you'll still only be able to afford something maybe for $300,000 after transaction fees, maybe even less, 260, which gets you, as I say, barely above the average, meaning that a lot of these will be affected by flats, for instance, which are much cheaper versus a house, which would have much more space and freedom and the ability to have a garden, which I know is a massive luxury nowadays for some bizarre reason. Okay, so when we think of the median weekly pay, you can then, as I said just now, track it towards how much you think a house might cost. And so when we look here, and this is from April, not all this data is the same from the same time frame, but I did try to get very, very up-to-date data, so let's say. But here you can see that the median weekly pay, and so for York and Humber, as we discussed just before, that amounts to about 2,500 quid a month, which is about 30,000 a year. And with this being full-time employees, you can consider most households to not have 2 full-time employed people. It's more something like 1.4 to 1.7, depending on the region. So generously we could say 45,000, which once again, if you max that out, you're still only talking about what would equate to £225,000 in borrowing. So you could max out, lucky you, your borrowing capacity have all your savings dumped into a house, and now you're able to live in the most median flat in what is Yorkshire and the Humber. So if you're an older person, maybe you will recognize that it was more expensive in my day in some way. What I will show you is that not only is that not true, even considering interest rates in terms of financing requirements, but here you can see that the percentage change in real median earnings, so just having a look at earnings now, but if we look at the change, so this is including inflation. Remember the bank, the Reserve Bank of the UK has a 2% inflationary target, which means that you're adjusted for inflation earnings, if you lived in the East or in London, have declined by, well, anywhere from 11 in the southeast to 16% in the east. But then it looks like Northern Ireland, actually you're up 1% in Northern Ireland. So if I'm telling you to go somewhere for more money, then it's at least Northern Ireland's coming out on top a little bit. But then, as you see here, contradistinction, the increase here is about, I would say, 100%. So it's 2x from 2012. This is from 2008. So we could fairly comfortably say this is maybe 120% more expensive to own a home in real dollars, well, real pounds, versus what your earnings would be. You're actually now 16% worse off, or 12% worse off. So not only, anyway, so the actual equation is both negative and positive in the worst ways. And unless you had a house and you're a retiree, because now your pension is tracked at least on inflation, and then you've also got a home which is now worth a lot more than when you probably bought it for in the 90s. And we know that homes are worse and that people are living further out. So you get a lower quality home using all your money and savings, and you have to live with a partner who has to probably work, which means they won't have time to spend looking after children, or etc. So you'll have extra costs around nursery or babysitters, etc. But then also your commute time is now much worse, which means you're moving to a house that's further away from your lodgings, from your work. Your lodgings are much farther away. So we can see here that the commute time, and this is per day of London, and this is, I think, over a 5-year period from 2011 to 2016, was up 4 minutes. And we can obviously safely say that trend is continuing, but you're now spending more and more time commuting because you're living further and further away from your job. And maybe you get the lucky IT career where you can work from home now, but at the same time, most are not as fortunate to be able to do that, and so there's still a consideration around a huge commute time. There's been zero infrastructure invested in the UK around the light speed or high speed rail, which is deleterious, obviously, if you're looking at improving the quality of experience in life. The tube itself is, I would consider, fine, but the ability to commute from anywhere outside of the zone 3-4 is just fairly, it's not very fun. So, which is to say that I think there's no consideration around infrastructure improvements, even though you now got way more people who are forced to drive in some instances, making congestion worse. And or if you're on trains, you know how annoying it is if you've got either a late train or a missed train, or there's strikes with the tube workers or whatever it is, and bus drivers, etc. So we're basically piling on a lot more negative factors when it comes to the experience of owning homes in certain places and how it relates to living your life. The other way I've sought to kind of frame it is around the how much I said you could borrow, right? But if you look at the house price to earnings ratio, and this is on the sorry, they got this from Nationwide, but this is on the average home price. So what the level of your house to earnings is, basically. And you can see that in London, you've got an 11x. So the average person earning needs 11 times their earnings to afford the equivalent in a house or a home, which is just unseemly and abhorrent to me. And I think it's a huge failing in government policy. You can see here that the dwellings in England grew in 20 years from 21.2 to about 25. So 3.8 million extra houses, but at that same time there was an increase of around 15 to 20 million people. And we know from our envelope maths that the average people per household dropped. So you're looking at a massive deficit in terms of housing stock. Now, housing stock in general, as I said before, and this is tying this back to the original thesis, is that you cannot put all the houses in the places that you need them. So even if the UK government said we're going to build a million houses, where are they? Where are they going to go? If half of them are in Belfast, that helps only Belfast. It doesn't help the rest of the country. If only 200,000 of them are in London, you're probably still short 200,000. And now only 800,000 get to be distributed around the rest of the country, who are also probably short. So the determinant behind how people are building is not very well met in terms of supply and demand in the UK, particularly around how housing development and the way that the councils interact with developers is not necessarily reflective of where people want to live and where they need to work and commute to, and then exactly how we can think about certain councils restricting and being quite prohibitive around what type of flats you can buy. So we can, well, if you walk around any of the major cosmopolitan areas, you can see massive, and these were the popular ones in the Soviet era in the UK, of these tenements, these council flats. And they're hideous. They're absolute eyesores. They have a huge amount of malfeasance and poor social behaviours, including things like assault, robbery, drugs, domestic violence, drug usage, as I said, and then drug dealing, gangs, things like that. So do you necessarily want to fix your housing crisis with more tenement housing? No, you don't want to build these monolithic, ugly behemoths that look like you're in a Judge Dredd comic, right? So you go, okay, we'd like to build nice looking ones which cost a lot, which means yuppies move in, so it's considered a gentrification, because necessarily you don't want to build ugly things. Developers want to make the most amount of money. So if you're a poor, struggling, lower middle class British person, you're quite out of luck in that regard. And considering that even the current interest rates here are at levels where you wouldn't say as super friendly to borrow, so there's probably quite a lot of people hoping that it goes back down to 1-2%, given that it's currently at about 5.5%, which means you're currently not incentivized to borrow because obviously the UK wants to avoid overheating their economy. But at the same time, what we're seeing is just a complete lack of support for someone to go out and buy their first home, for instance, or if it is an upgrade to a more hospitable area with schooling and all these other considerations. So once again, if you're over 45 and you already have your forever home, or you've bought a home in an area that you want, then it's appreciated to a point where you're probably able to remortgage some of that out to renovate it, etc. So you're not as in trouble. But anyone under 45 is going to be annihilated by this trend, and it's going to get worse rather than get better, unfortunately. So that would be what I would say is the précis of why the housing market in the UK is so horrible, and that it's making a massive social impact towards people's well-being and happiness. It is a political problem that can be solved politically, but once again, as with most of these things, both the Tories and the Labour have no regard to actual problem solving through policy, but rather talking about problems in Parliament to then suggest a very generic end. We'll introduce, like I said before, 1 million new houses. The considerations of where they go, how that affects people's ability to buy them, these are all what we call footnotes in a manifesto that don't actually have any reasoning or any mapping to a reality where you're actually better off. So unfortunately, bad news for all you young British men and women in the prime of your lives, with a lower amount of money being earned and the desire to move out of your mother's granny flat out the back of your parents' house, which they've fully paid off since the 80s, is that you'll have to wait probably another 5 years of saving to then hope that interest rates come down and that maybe something can be done in terms of housing supply in that time, although I would not hold your breath.